I'm Doug Muzzio. This is City Talk. Error margins, random samples, push polls, exit polls, robo polls, internet polls, confidence levels. Oi. Here this week and next to talk about the good, the bad, and the truly ugly of polling, the myths and the misconceptions, is Micheline Blum, Director of Baruch Survey Research at the Baruch School of Public Affairs. Mickey is a founding partner of the highly regarded polling firm of Blum and Wepper and Associates, and in her 30-year career has polled for major local, national, and international media and nonprofits. She's managed NBC News' polling and election operations. Welcome back, Mickey.
Thank you.
Nice color choice.
I was about to compliment yours.
And do you like our new set?
Very much, very much.
And you get to see Obama and I get to see McCain.
And he's wearing a similar color.
That's right. We'll see how this works out. Simple question.
Yes.
Can we trust the polls?
Can I quote the oi that you started this with? It depends which poll, really. Yes, you can trust the polls if we're talking about most of the major media polls. But are there some polls you should not trust? Absolutely.
And we'll talk about those. But before we ask the questions about polls, give the viewers a sense of what it's like actually to conduct an election or political poll. You polled for everybody. You polled for New York One, the Daily News, Dallas Morning News. I can go on and on and on and on. You get a call from the Daily News saying, okay, Mickey, we're going to do an election poll. What do you do? What is it like? Talk to me from the time you get to the call to you being quoted on, on page 1 or 2 of the paper.
Okay. First step is to really find out what they want, because it sounds like it's very simple. We want a poll, a political poll, so you want to know who's ahead or who's behind. But there's more to it. There may be specific questions. Are they interested in looking at Hillary voters? Are they interested in something more than just the horse race? Okay. So the first question is really what they're looking for, because from that, a lot of other things flow, both the questions that you're going to ask and even some things about the sampling, because depending on what they're really looking for, how large a sample, what's the sample.
Okay. So you determine, you get the answers to that questions. What do you do now?
Okay, so now simultaneously we're working on the questions that we want to ask and we're drawing the sample.
Okay, what does it mean to draw a sample?
Okay.
And we'll talk about this in greater depth later on, but go ahead.
Okay. For most major media polls, for the polls I do, for a lot of academic polls, we draw what are called random digit dial samples.
So you use telephones?
So they're telephone samples. It's still, at this point, the best way to sample the American public. And if you're trying to get everybody, telephone is still the best way to go. And we get those samples from, there are a few places that actually have huge databases of every exchange and area code all around the country, and you can get. So
firms actually exist to provide pollsters with these random samples.
Right.
You don't necessarily draw it yourself, even though you have.
No, you direct exactly what it is you want, what area you want, if you just want a state, if you wanted the city, if you want the whole country, do you want a 50-state sample, 48, continent sample, how large a sample you need, that kind of thing. Okay,
so you get your sample. So you know the questions. But you're in conversation with the sponsor. What are you talking about?
So here we're talking about what it is they want to know.
Right.
You know, where they're going with this. What stories are they looking for? What kinds of questions do they want? And then we're going to work on the questions. The questions are not so simple. In fact, they're really very, very difficult to word them properly, so that in no way, you know, are you biasing the answer that you're getting, and you're getting the information that you want, that people will understand the question that you're asking and be able to answer it, and you know, give
So now
their
you have
opinion.
a questionnaire and a sample. What do you do?
And then, depending on whether you have your own phone room or you're doing this at some other call center, this is when you actually are going to you may, if you have time, pre-test your poll. Meaning that you may try it out on 20 people, on 50 calls, just to make sure that it flows the way you want it to. If you're in a big hurry because this is election polling and you maybe need to get this on the air very quickly or in the paper very quickly, you may only get to test it a little bit to make sure that there isn't anything that goes wrong.
The respondents are understanding what the questions
exactly.
mean, it flows, etc. Okay, so you pre-test it, then what do you do?
And we make sure that all of our callers understand it. They get briefed on it, which means that we go through the questionnaire together, read it aloud, go through what are likely to come up as questions that respondents may ask them, what they may and may not say to them if that happens, because we don't want any of the people making the calls to give their opinions and influence the respondents in any way.
I mean, interviewer effects.
Exactly. On the other hand, you want them to be able to encourage them to answer and to go on and take the next question and to respond in a way that where we can use the answers, because sometimes it's difficult for people. So you asked somebody a question where you ask if you strongly support something or support it somewhat, and somebody says, oh, I support that. And so we'll say, well, now you have to probe to find out if that's strongly or somewhat.
Okay, so you're actually conducting the survey. Now, if I walk into this phone center, what do I see? What's going on?
You see a large room full of people on telephones with computers in front of them, because they're doing it all on a computer screen. They're getting the questions up on the computer screen, and the numbers that they're calling are being controlled by a computer. They're not choosing them. They have no idea who they're calling.
Right.
They're just
calling a number.
They're calling a number. And sometimes, depending on how you answer a question, if you, for instance, we're doing primary polling and you ask a question about what party you are registered with, and they answer Democrat, then the next question that's going to come up is going to be the Democratic.
So it branches off, but
questions.
The computer does all the branching for you.
The computer will do it all, so that there's no,
And then they input the data so you're really getting data in real time. You could turn it around very quickly.
You can turn
I remember
it around.
the old days when we used pencil and paper and then inputted the data.
Exactly. Now it's really fast, and by the end of the evening, you have everything you got that day. All the responses of the people who answered your poll that day.
Okay, so you complete the desired number of survey interviews, and we'll talk about sample size and all of that in a bit. Then what happens?
Well, depending on how long you're in the field, as it's called, whether this is a poll that's 1 day, 2 days, 3 days, a week, whatever it is, for an election poll, it's not going to be very long in the field, because time will have a real effect on this. It's very time sensitive, so you aren't in the field very long. But once it's over, then we take the results and we weight them, and this is an important.
Okay, let's get a little bit specific here. What do you mean weight? When I hear weight, and when I look at polls that are weighted, cooking the numbers.
Exactly, and weighting is something that's necessary if it's done right, but it can be a way of cooking the numbers.
So you get results, let's say, and you look at the results by race and gender and income and education. And what does this weight mean?
Okay, if we have polled a general population, then what we weight it back to are census figures, so that our sample shouldn't look terribly different from the
along
census
those
to
variables
start
like
with.
race and gender.
Right. If it looks wildly different, there's maybe a problem with your sample, and all the weighting in the world isn't really going to help you. But if it's sort of not terribly off, but it's not going to be exact. It's not going to have exactly the right number of people of every age group, of racial groups. And so we weight it back to certain census numbers so that we reflect the country as well as possible.
Okay. Then you sit down with a reporter?
Yes. Oh, wait. Beyond that,
I'm sorry.
also now need to look at who are we looking at? Are we looking at everybody?
Okay.
Are we looking at registered voters? Are we looking at likely voters? And if we're looking at likely voters, how are we deciding what's a likely voter? And a lot of that may depend on where we are in the year.
So you start with the general population when nobody knows nothing, and then you move to
registered voters. And usually when you're talking about an election, you're talking about mostly about registered voters. But then as we get closer to the election, we start talking about likely voters.
I would think that from now on, post-Labor Day, as the general election campaign begins, which really has begun months and months ago, you would never be talking about registered voters, and you're always talking about, in some sense, likely voters.
From here on in, we probably are on almost all of the polls, you will see likely voters.
Okay.
Up until now, a lot of it probably has been registered voters, and that has made some sense. But as we get into the fall, it will be likely.
Okay,
voters.
let's continue our discussion of how do you determine what a likely voter is? Not all polls use the same criteria, or screens, if you will, to determine what a likely voter is. What's a likely voter?
Well, there is no such thing as, a likely voter for every poll. Every organization has its own way of determining what the likely electorate is and who a likely voter is. And what's more, sometimes that even varies from year to year and election to election. So in some years, your past vote and whether you've voted, you always vote or you mostly vote, is one of the things that people may use. Whether you voted in the previous election that's similar to this one may be used. Now, this year, when we have lots and lots of new voters, first-time voters in the primaries, it did not necessarily serve people well to have only kept in people who had voted in previous primaries.
Okay. Now, let's look at a big picture here. A 2001 Kaiser family survey found that Americans were really woefully ignorant about polling. Woefully ignorant. Okay. Let's ask some questions. Let's go back now and ask questions about what you just described. Now, we still haven't talked about you talking to the reporter yet. We're going to talk about that a little bit later on. Let's talk about sampling. The Kaiser survey found that people really don't get sampling. Let me ask you, how does 1,000 people or 600 people represent 210 million adult Americans? Americans don't buy that only 600 people could represent the entire adult population of the United States. Explain.
It's the wonders of probability.
Okay.
And probability sampling. It doesn't work if it's just any old 600 people or 1,000 people. It has to really be sampled properly, and it has to be a random sample. It has to be a probability sample.
Okay. What does that mean, a random sample or a probability sample?
It means that everybody has to have a chance of being included in the sample.
So they need an equal chance.
And at least a measurable chance. Now and then we have something where everybody doesn't have exactly an equal chance, but they need to be able to be included. The minute that you've done something to exclude, so for instance, if you sample from a list of any kind, who's not on that list?
Right.
If it's listed phone numbers, well, whose phone numbers aren't included?
Right.
You really want to make sure that everybody's included and everybody has a chance to be included in this sample.
Okay.
And the same chance. Basically.
Explain then how you actually do. How do you randomize? So the computer generates exchanges and gives you a list of residential phone numbers. So it comes up on the screen, like you said, and you make the call. So it goes dring, dring, and I answer the phone call. What does the interviewer say to me?
Okay, now not only have we randomized the phone numbers because the computer has done that,
right?
But now we have to randomize within the household.
So you just can't interview the first person.
No, because and people know this, in almost every household, it's probably the same person who almost always answers the phone. We can't just sample those people who are most likely to answer the phone. We have to try to randomize within that household.
Okay, so it's double randomization.
So it's a randomization yet again.
Okay. And how do you do? Okay.
How do you do that?
How do you do that?
Okay, there are different ways to do that. One of the ways is actually sort of a funny way if people aren't used to it, which is to ask them who had the most recent birthday in the household.
Well, that's the one that most survey.
And because it's very simple, because people who live in the same household, and know who had the most recent birthday, and because there's no particular bias in choosing that.
So I answer the phone and you ask who had the nearest birthday, and it happens to be me. So you talk to me.
So now
but it's not me, it's my wife.
Then I'm going to ask if your wife is there, and you're going to put her on the phone if she's there. If she's not there, I'm going to ask when the best time is to call back.
So you call back to make sure that you get.
Absolutely.
How many times do you call back?
And that also varies from poll to poll, and it depends on how much time you're going to be out in the field. If you're going to be out for a few days, you're not going to be calling back 20 times.
Okay. Okay, so that's sampling. So we've got a representative sample, and this 600 people or this 1,000 people represents the opinions of, let's say, the general adult population of the United States, 210 million Americans. Okay, now, what is the error margin of this sample, and what does that mean, and how is it computed, and what doesn't it mean?
Well, it doesn't mean you've made mistakes. Let's start with that.
Right. It's not error in that sense.
It's not error in that sense, but it's giving you this little range that if I get 51% to 49%, it's telling me that it could be, if it's 1,000 people, it could be 3 points more than that or 3 points less than that.
So it's
giving me a range.
The size of the sample determines the error margin. So
Right.
1,000 people, it's 3%. 600 people, it's 4%.
Right,
whatever.
exactly.
And the larger the sample, the smaller the margin. But after a certain point,
it doesn't matter anymore.
Yeah, I mean,
and that's part of why you don't need
a lot of
20,000 people in order to represent the country. You really, with 1,000 people, you are getting, a good sample, because even if you went then to 1,500 or 2,000 or something, you really won't reduce your error margin that much anymore.
You've used the jelly bean explanation, the chicken soup explanation, and the blood sample explanation to describe sampling.
Right.
Pick one and tell me how a little bit of sample gives you a representation.
Well, I mean, the blood one is just that I don't need to take all the blood from your body to find out what's going on. I can really just take a sample of your blood and I will and find out your cholesterol rate or something. these kinds of things, we don't really need to sample, 50,000 people in order to get a good sample. The 1,000 really does work, and it works again and again and again.
As long as it's random.
As long as it's random.
I mean, you've got the famous Literary Digest poll of 1936, which had 2.7 million respondents, and they had Alf Landon with 56% of the vote, and Franklin Roosevelt with 30%,
Right.
and Roosevelt got 60% of the vote.
Right, because it wasn't everybody, and it wasn't random. It was, not everybody was included. It was just a particular group that was included.
Automobile owners and telephone owners.
And a group that and a lot of people were not included, and even within that, they weren't randomly sampled. So we need to look whenever you're looking at a poll or a sample that somebody's done. You need to know who was included, who was not included, and how was it selected.
Okay. Now, the latest poll that I saw, and this is going to change, but for illustration, had Barack Obama at 49% and John McCain at 41%. And let's say the error margin was plus or minus 4. What is that error margin telling me?
Okay, it's telling me that it's possible that 49% is as high as 53%.
That's plus 4.
Plus 4, or as low as 45%.
Minus 4.
Which would be minus 4. And in the case of the 41%, it could be as high as 45%. Or as low as 37%. So it's possible that that they are really as close, that they are actually tied at 45 each, or that it's as far apart as whatever it was, 37 to 53.
Right, exactly.
That is possible. It doesn't mean that it's just as likely that it's 45.
That's a
45.
common misconception,
yes.
that the extremes are as likely as the number that actually results from the statistics.
Right, and that's not the case, and it's one of the reasons people tend to refer to certain things which are within an error margin as being tied, a statistical tie, and it's not really a tie. It just means that it's not. You don't have a 95% chance that this is the number that this person's ahead, but they're still probably ahead. It's just that the probability isn't quite 95%.
Okay, so if it's within the margin of error, it's close. Or roughly equal, but it's not tied.
Yeah, if somebody has an edge,
Okay.
they have some likelihood that they're ahead.
Suppose if it's twice the error margin, though,
Well, now somebody's really ahead.
Okay, they're really ahead. Now,
They're
suppose
really
if you're in
ahead.
between. Suppose if you're between one margin of error and 2. How do you describe that?
Well, people use all different kinds of words. Some say just, some have a point at which they say ahead, and some point where they just say someone has an edge.
Okay.
Where they say it's a lead, where they don't.
But a lot of this is subjective language.
Absolutely.
Here. Okay. We focus in on sampling, but that's the most easy. That's the only quantifiable error. There's a lot of other error that's even greater than the error produced by the error margin, and these are real errors, like in mistakes, for example. Talk about question wording and question order, which you mentioned at the top of the show.
Well, it matters very much how you ask a question, and that can be anything from, if we're talking about, let's say we are talking about candidates, if I refer to Hillary Clinton as Hillary, as Mrs. Clinton, as Senator Clinton, all of those are a little bit different.
Okay.
They can be just enough different to give people a different feeling about her, to give a different response. One person's freedom fighter is another person's terrorist.
Right.
You have to be very careful about the words that you choose. Is something pro-choice, pro-abortion? You're going to get a different answer depending on how you ask that question.
Okay. What about question order? Give an illustration of how question order might affect the outcome of a poll.
Well, if, for example, you're asking, you want to ask an approval rating of whether it's President Bush or it's the mayor or something, and you were to ask a whole lot, you were going to ask about, let's say it's President Bush, and we started out by asking about the war in Iraq, Katrina, right, the economy, and then asked your feelings about President Bush. Well, it might lower it somewhat. You know, it can affect it. So, especially with election polling, we care very much to ask about the vote questions up front before we introduce issues, before we introduce any other topics, because any other topic could potentially have an effect.
Okay, let's briefly talk about myths and misconceptions. What are the big misconceptions out there? And that will play in this election season.
Well, there are many. One of them is that people lie to pollsters, and that they lie all the time, that they just get on the phone and lie to pollsters. And in fact, that's really very rare. If you don't want to tell a pollster something, you're just not going to talk to them. You're just not going to take that poll, or you're going to refuse to answer a specific question. One
of the areas where this presumed lying takes place is the so-called Bradley effect and race. Talk about that very briefly.
In fact, I think people don't usually do that. Don't usually lie about saying they're going to vote for a black candidate and then in fact go vote for a white candidate. Named after
mayor and then gubernatorial candidate Tom Bradley.
While there may be some overestimation at times of a particular candidate's vote from a poll, it's not usually because of lying. It's much more likely that it's because of who we did get or didn't get on that, or something that in fact changes along the line. When you look at exit polls, for example,
which we'll talk about next show,
exit polls often show a slight bias toward the Democratic candidate, or in the primaries, I think a bit toward Obama. Now, that has to do with the fact that younger people and more liberal voters are both more likely to be willing to take those polls.
So there's an element of self-selection in the exit poll that you really caution against, because that's not random.
It's not random, and that's a different kind of error. That is not random error.
Okay. Real quickly, what really ticks you off about what your fellow pollsters do? What at the top of your ticked off list?
Okay. Waiting by party ID. I think is probably one of my major peeves, and then I think the poll of polls.
Okay, we'll talk about the poll of polls in the next show. This has been the first of a two-part City Talk on polling with Micheline Blum, director of Baruch Survey Research. Tune in next week for more on the good, the bad, and the ugly of polling. Thank you. Hello, I'm Doug Muzzio. Let us know what you think about this show. You can reach us at CUNY.TV. When you get there, click on the bar that says Contact Us and send your email. Whatever it is. Thanks, no thanks, obnoxious, do it. Send it.